came to this country, well, actually, no, hold on. Let's speed this up a bit. I'm thankful that God does not see us in categories, within the same categories as we're prone by the devices of Satan and man to see ourselves. This is evidenced by the fact that he did not stop my hand the last time that I filled out a form to sign up for college. The form I was signing asked me to specify my race, and I decided to mix things up a bit and write that I was Asian. No, really, you can check my records. I don't know what prompted me precisely to do this, but it's just as mysterious as the reason I had never done it before. That being chiefly that I'd never hitherto identified as anything other than white. And it must have been conditioned because at some point or another I asked, well, what should I put down? And they said, well, just put down Caucasian. Because they didn't really have the label white back then as far back as I can remember. But if one really thinks about it, it makes a lot of logical sense that I put down Asian. Since I came from a country that is not only occupied predominantly by the Asian continent, but actually occupies the Asian continent predominantly. And it's interesting to note also that this old gentleman I knew named Lee once saw my father at a McDonald's that we were hanging out at and said with surprise, he looks Chinese, despite his pale skin. And of course, Lee would know. And it's quite probable, given that observation, that that my family line goes back and its roots run over the Ural Mountains into the east. But simply because I was technically born in the European part of Russia, in Moscow, and because apparently I didn't quite have enough melatonin in my skin to qualify as Asian, and maybe in part because my mother was born in Moldavia, and I commend you if you know where that country is, or have even heard of it before, which is this very small Jewish country, I was compelled to put down that I was Caucasian or white. But I had no idea what I was getting myself into, because back then I didn't even know the word asshole. And I think at one point, actually, someone once told me to use that word in front of a teacher. So I'm like, okay. And I found out that's a word that we don't use in elementary school. But apparently, white means asshole. Contextually speaking, it's practically, if you really look at it, totally exchangeable with how we use asshole. Because asshole is a very vague word too, much as white is an exceptionally vague term. And it's funny because I don't think I'm usually an asshole. I mean, I used to think that. But then I realized, I'm only an asshole if people treat me like assholes. So in a very funny way, it's almost like I became white through the ways I've been oppressed. Isn't it funny how that works? The framework is that there is no such thing as race. Race is a bureaucratic construct devised systematically with the sole intent of gaining profit, and also as a way of maintaining one's economic power, which is the production of profit, keeping people within a society of incredible ethnic diversity and multiplicity in line by pitting them against one another, so that they will police each other in such a way that the government does not have to. You see, I know that if I go back in my personal history, which is always going to be more real than any abstract notion of my family's genealogy or anything, I really adopted the mask of being a white man or white male, despite my identification with gender, because it supposedly exists on other dimensions outside of this one. More or less arbitrarily. I mean, it was arbitrary when my family first moved to Baltimore, and we lived in a little apartment in the basement floor, where people would creep in and look through our windows. And I had a happy childhood, a very happy childhood, with a lot of chicken and Kool-Aid. And I guess I hung out with the black kids. I don't know, or maybe that just started when I came to California, but it tapered off very quickly when they began to develop their own minority identity and stopped talking to me as much and started talking with the other black kids as much, which always kind of surprised me, considering that I'd grown up, despite my parents' attempts to do otherwise, on Kenan and Kel, and then eventually Chingy and Ludacris and stuff like that, until I hit the age of maturity and developed my own interest in music, which just happened to have been made predominantly by pale people from the Pacific Northwest, with their own issues. And it became also very clear to me in high school, in the midst of my depression, that these people, these white folks who were making this indie music, knew so much more about pain than Chingy or Ludacris, because just listen to their lyrics. Hip-hop had become entirely about being in a position of power, being the master, and in a weird way, it seemed as though, to speak in Hegelian terms, Isaac Brock and Elliott Smith and Justin Vernon were speaking from the position of the slave. And I don't know if it's something in my Jewish heritage or whatever, but that just clicked for me in high school. The recognition that there were people out there who could be honest about their suffering. I certainly didn't find that in hip-hop music, at least not in on the commercial radio. And I didn't find it in hip-hop music until much later, when I found underground hip-hop. But the point is that we're living in a post-racial age. And considering just how nuanced my own circumstances were, it wouldn't even fucking cross my mind to look at a person and to presume, that person's probably privileged. Oh, that person's a bit sketch. That person's a gangbanger. Oh, no, this had to be conditioned. Because despite, being taught in high school that you shouldn't look at people with prejudice, in a funny way, when I got to college, I was taught a new set of prejudices. And I'm like, nigga, get out of here. I learned about this stuff in elementary school. You're not going to fool me with this Nazi bullshit. So when I hear the term white privilege, I'm like, see, you can't say that. I think that people 1,000 years from now would find it really very, very funny how stupid we were. Because not only did we manage for several hundred years to really mistreat the dark people in this country, because apparently they had too much melatonin, and of course it's an oversimplification. A lot of them were bought from people with just as much melatonin as they had. So it was really just another capitalist thing. Woot. Free market. But then, at the turn of the millennium, we started treating all the pale people badly. As though they hadn't had it rough when they first came over here. Consistently. No, we just presumed upon a narrative of history which always made them the villain. And we decided to more or less clump them in almost as though in a ghetto, with the Irish Americans, the Italian Americans, Greek Americans, Jewish Americans, Russian Americans, just because it's easier that way if you have absolutely no interest in being a civil person and you didn't really pay attention in middle school to what all this stuff about the Civil War was actually about. There's no such thing as reverse discrimination because there's nothing to reverse. Race is purely illusory. And there's no such thing as affirmative action because any action that is based on the presupposition that God sees us in categories and that statistics are His word is always going to be negative. Because like I said, I was just born a human being. You don't know the bullshit I've been through just by looking at me. And I thought that that would be the theme that would stick. But apparently not. Because if you grow up in a privileged condition, but you happen to be colored, you might be very tempted to say, oh yeah, I'm a real OGT. This is what they did to my people. I'm going to get back at them. And that's always going to come from a position of privilege. Because anyone who's truly suffered, well, let me put it this way. They say that religion is for people who are trying to avoid hell. They say that spirituality is for people who've been through it. I'm not here to argue for some conception, some Western conception of God. I'm here to argue against the Western conception of history. That same Western conception of history that, frankly, the minorities in this country, a lot of them stole from the German tradition, which was passed on by the so-called white man, and abused. You see, Western philosophy has come a long way since Hegel, and it's actually drawn a lot on Eastern philosophy. Yet, as a result of Americanization, as a result of people really wanting to take advantage of the lifestyle provided to them by the white man, and that includes me, I don't mean the white man, I'm taking advantage of it too, don't get me wrong. I was just white by choice, now I'm Asian by choice, right? But, as a result of people taking advantage of this, they've disavowed a lot of their heritage, such as the Buddhist notion of history, the Hindu notion of history, the Taoist notion of history. And America has spilled over into the countries where these things originated, so now these traditions are little by little dying, much like the shamanic traditions in this country. It's really fucking ironic that people who crusade for the rights of the minority of Native Americans who are really just still alive to own an incredible deal of land, also self-identify in many cases as Marxists or liberals. Because you know that if we did apportion all of that land that was rightfully theirs to that small group of people, that would certainly not be from each according to his ability to each according to his need. They'd be living in tremendous excess. So there's always a hypocrisy in the liberal community because of its notions of history, because of its fixation on Hegel's master-slave dialectic, and its ignorance of those philosophical traditions that followed Hegel. Because we're more than happy to use this notion that the privileged white man cannot complain because he's the master and everyone else is the slave, and we distrust the master, according to Hegel, and who influenced Marx, who influenced liberalism, and Hegel, who was cited, apparently, by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. Maybe rightfully so in his case, but you don't get to pick your fans, do you? So it's really remarkable to walk into college campus and see that people still think that race is an issue. Well, racism is an issue, but not in the world. In your head. And it's not like even you're racist, you're just dreaming it up. Because there was no point at human history when human beings were intrinsically predisposed towards seeing people in these categories. That's just like saying that God programmed us that way. But he doesn't even see us that way. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's dream was that of equality in a world beyond race. Yet we look at a few statistics which are constructed along this paradigm, and we think race still exists. Well, it does from the perspective of the statistics, but why would you believe in a statistic that cuts the pie that way? Why would you think that that proves anything out in the world, and that justifies violence out in the world? See, Derrida would find that hilarious. But we disavow Derrida because he's a little bit too tough to understand. Because he's so recent as a thinker, and this is the only reason, that he hasn't had the pervasive influence of someone as blatantly, frankly, white and traditional and rational and German as Gottfried Hegel. And we don't even know who this Hegel character is because we don't study history the right way. We study history thinking that it has a series of facts that we've arrived at, and once we have those facts, we don't need to study them anymore. This is the Derridian argument also. But really, we never fucking know what happened. People who deny the Holocaust, a lot of them might be bitter, but there's something wise about that. And only if you go back far enough into something like Asian history, you'd understand why that's the case. But colleges aren't interested anymore in educating people. They're interested in telling people how to think. They become instruments for proto-fascism, much as Hegel was accused of being a proto-fascist historically. And we know that he was cited alongside Nietzsche as an influence on the Nazis. Don't get to pick your fans, do you? So it becomes very frustrating after a while to hear about notions such as white male privilege. Manifest destiny might seem like a really bad idea, but it's made this country into a powerhouse. And if you're against this powerhouse, then you also have to be against what it produces within its media and in the form of statistics. If you're a proponent of this powerhouse, well, congratulations. You've managed to see the paradox of it. That despite tremendous violence done on both sides between Native Americans and you might say first-generation immigrants, OGT first-generation immigrants, and despite capitalism exploiting an already thriving slave trade on the continent of Africa, we have managed to create a society which is a very, very heated melting pot of cultures. Where, and by melting pot, I don't mean it all melts into one gumbo type stew, or sorry, one kind of what's that cheese thing that they have? Fondue. More like a kind of gumbo, where it kind of more or less melts into one another, but you can still see chunks here and there, such as in Chinatown, San Francisco, and I don't know, wherever the Jewish Quarter is in New York, so on and so forth. It's very ethnically and ethically naive for us to maintain our notions of white as anything more than a very relative term. Because what does white really mean? White means dominator. White means I'm going to tell you what to do. As though people in Compton, California don't speak of dominating territory and running the streets. White means majority. But if you really think about it, a heterosexual white male, though theoretically being a confluence of majorities, and not even the male part, is a minority, except in certain circumstances. We walk into a bar and maybe see predominantly pale people and think this must be a Nazi gathering, which is funny because a lot of them might not even be German. And this isn't me being a smartass. This is real. This is reality. A lot of them, okay, maybe the bartender's German. It's not like Germans came over on the Mayflower. It was Brits. And you think about it. Well, why do you hate on Germany? I mean, maybe Germany is predominantly pale. Well, you're saying that they're not as good of a country, just because they had a very brief, though very effective and efficient and evil, though maybe I shouldn't use that word, run with fascism. But you think that they're inferior just because they don't have quite the melting pot that we do? Well, look at why we have a melting pot. It's because of the same people, arguably, who nearly drove shamanism to extinction. And if you're that interested in Native American culture, why are you operating according to a Western view of history? You're too happy to use Western forms of record keeping and of making sense of the past. And you say this isn't philosophy. This is just common sense. As though, where does common sense come from? It comes from people thinking and being heard. But it's funny. A number of Europeans seem to have grown up and realized, history isn't like that. It's a scramble suit of ambiguity, depending also on who's telling it and for what intent. We dismiss that as philosophy because it hasn't been on the scene as long, and frankly, it requires work to understand that, and it threatens one's entire worldview. The point is, we need to get out of this notion of race. Because, quite simply put, it's not all black and white. There are systems of oppression in this country, which I won't go into, which are not covered at all in the media. And systematically and repeatedly, I see people buying into this, and I've been a victim of them. But you wouldn't know that looking at me, would you? Because it goes deeper than the surface. It's so easy to look around at people and say, well, there's a nigger, oh, there's a privileged person, there's a spick, there's a cholo, and who knows, maybe sometimes you're right. Maybe sometimes you meet someone who totally meets that stereotype. You meet someone who's domineering and has been in this country for 5 generations or so, and has fat fingers and that are choked by a wedding ring, has some very deep-seated prejudices and also a lot of money. You might also meet someone of darker skin who's also been here for a lot of generations and who hangs out with gangs. Or just a brown person who just smokes herb all the time and just rolls around catcalling women. I mean, we know the stereotypes in this country, but they're constructs. Really, when you get to know people, you see how nuanced it is. For instance, there's one fellow that we met whose brother had apparently been involved in some neo-Nazism of some sort. And he was once jumped by a number of African Americans who called him a nigger. Later, this same young man who saw his brother getting jumped, thankfully his brother survived, saw one of the, ostensibly one of, I mean, he seemed really certain about it. He pretty much saw one of the people that had been involved in that gang by himself. So what he did was he took out his knife. He handed his knife to his friend nearby because he wasn't going to use his knife. And he walked up to this young man and started beating him and said the same word that he'd heard used, nigger. The police showed up, 2 officers, both dark-skinned, pulled him off the man, And because they'd heard that one word that we hear all the time in hip-hop music, he was charged with a hate crime. He would have gone away to prison or jail for life. Had it not been for his grandmother, who was actually a records keeper in the prison system, and within the last few months of her life, decided to save her son by committing what we would call a form of fraud. This young man was one of the most authentic and probably genuinely kind people that my friend Daniel Mendez and I had ever met. He'd been through so much, such a troubled life. And yet, when he caught his basically his wife cheating on him with his cousin, he knew he had to take off, and he left her the house that he bought for her. Through a series of activities. I think some of them might have involved drug peddling, but there were probably other sources of income as well. And it's funny. Our debate coach, who's known for being a very progressive cat, had once used the words hate crime in a way that carried a lot of almost a preacher's candor, saying, if you shout this word or something, or if you attack this kind of person, or in this kind of area, that's a hate crime. And I thought, and it felt almost like, this is very serious. But I thought, well, why does it have to be that way? Why can't you just charge a person for what that person does? As Nietzsche would say, one's actions, not one's soul. But it took a while until I met someone who'd been accused of a hate crime. And arguably, unfairly. And why? Just because he was white. By some definition. And because he'd used a word that apparently he's not allowed to use. For the same reasons that his brother decided to join a gang. I mean, why is it that only ethnic minorities are allowed to join gangs? I don't think gangs are good in any circumstance. But I certainly don't want some gangs to be prioritized over others. I don't want anyone monopolizing the streets with organized violence. I mean, hell, the founding fathers, for all of their historical flaws, had some good ideas that they laid down in the law. Do you really want people who are systematically violent running the streets? I mean, in a way, we need neo-Nazis in order to keep dangerous non-white gangs from taking over. But at the end of the day, all that it reflects is one's own prejudices. Race does not exist. So whenever you make an accusation of racism, which you'll notice I haven't done at once over the course of this speech, and it's been 30 minutes almost, you're really just reflecting your own prejudices. And you can't even agree, probably, with most other people about what a white body is, or a black body is, or a brown body is. All these things occur on a spectrum and as a confluence of forces. And they're changing all the time, depending on what culture you find yourself in, what situation you find yourself in, and also how you're thinking. Really, Derrida got it right. It's the difference between logocentrism and post-structural thought is that people who are proto-fascist and logocentric are basically prejudiced. They don't think, they know. They know that this person's a white person. When this person gets up in front of a podium, we see this person, we think, he's a bearded white male. We don't think, oh, he's Russian, Jewish, German, unless we've really taken time to study those cultures and might identify him by some peculiar pattern, which would be okay. But the alternative to that is thinking, deconstructing, and also deconstructing our notions of what race are, and our notions of what racism and white privilege, neither of which exist.